Thank you, Jeff. I appreciate your presence here today. We cannot solve all the problems of the world. We cannot heal the wounds in ourselves or in our friends or those we know and love. But we can exercise empathy, and we can be with one another in a loving way. And sometimes that is enough. In August of 2021, I stood in line at the Walgreens on Cloverdale Avenue in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, during my lunch break. I was there because I wanted to get some medicine. I had a pain in my left ankle, which had been, is that a sound that, does anybody hear a sound? It sounds like someone digging for the truth. Let's just admire that sound for a moment. I'll turn. Well, I don't know. We might turn this into a meditation where we reflect on how life can be disrupted at any moment, right? Which is true. Very good lesson. There we go. So it'll be a struggle between me and the sound. Who will win? Well, I will try to dance around this. Is that okay with y'all? Yeah. We'll try to work with it. So there I am, and I've got pain in my left ankle, and it's really bothering me. And it took me about 10 days to figure out what the problem was, and it was gout. So I was there at long last trying to get some medication for my ankle. There were about 3 people in front of me. There were several lines. It was quite crowded. And I'm standing there wallowing in my own suffering, and a man appears on my right about 15 feet away. He just shows up in no mask. Everybody else is wearing masks because we're in the midst of COVID. And he begins to talk in a loud voice to just nobody in particular, just to the universe, but obviously he's speaking to the people behind the counter. Do you have any proof that the vaccines you are giving to people for COVID are effective? Show me proof that what you are giving the public is safe. I want to see, and he goes on in this vein for some time, right? And everybody freezes, and the woman behind the counter, behind the plexiglass area, acts like she has seen this before. And she simply says, you must go talk to the pharmacist. Like the pharmacist is going to help this guy. And so he dutifully goes from this side, walks behind me, and I'm trying to give him mean looks, but it doesn't help. And he goes over there, and he goes to the counter, and he goes to that place where the pharmacist talks to somebody, and he launches into his speech again. Do you have proof? And so forth. And after about 30 seconds, the pharmacist just waves him away and goes back to his place. I was so angry and so judgmental because I had just gone through an experience in which I was concerned about the survival of the congregation I was working with because of COVID and because of having to look at worship services over the internet and on, and people like him were disrupting society. And our institutions and on, and I had very little patience because my leg was hurting, and I began to fantasize of things I might do to him. And my fantasies were running so wild that I actually looked around for something that I could use to beat him about the head and shoulders. And I was just in my frantic state of mind about to carry out some kind of unministerial act, and then I realized, wait a minute, this would not look good in the papers. Local minister beats man in local pharmacy. UUs have enough bad publicity, I wasn't going to go there. So I didn't. Well, I stewed in my anger. I left the pharmacy, I got the medicine, I took the medicine, but in the hours after that, I realized this was not some random action. He had a script. He had a plan. He was carrying out some mission. I marinated in my robust and righteous anger for some time, cooling down after a few hours. But then the subject of empathy rose in my mind, because it just so happened to be the case that I was going to speak about empathy in 2 weeks. And I thought to myself, is empathy really an idealistic notion? Is it something that sounds good on paper or in our minds, but in practice cannot work? Because empathy would be most useful in those cases where we are dealing with people who we disagree with, would it not be? And here comes the sound again. I'll just dance with the sound and see how it works. So there I am, thinking to myself, am I going to be guilty of talking about something that I really don't believe in? Well, I thought about this and thought about it. And then I said to myself, okay, there we go. Mystery solved. Let's give a hand to. This is known as teamwork. So I felt guilty because when I get up in front of people, I want to tell them what I actually believe is true, not something that in my imagination I think is good, but something that is really true. And could I be empathetic toward this person? And I began to think it through. In the week after, and I thought to myself, what would it be like to be inside this man's perspective? And here's what I thought, and I don't know if this is accurate, but here's what I thought. I thought I would have to depend entirely on others to give me beliefs that could give me confidence. I could not develop, or I shied away, or I was immune to developing an internal guidance system from within myself based on facts and what I actually felt and believed and knew to be true. I was so reliant on outside power. I could not trust my own mind, my own emotions, my own feelings to guide me, to help me. I could not trust what I intuitively believed was right. I could not listen to wise people around me who might help me. I had to succumb to the authority of someone who was so certain about their beliefs, that I was attracted to it because I could borrow a strength external to myself that I knew I didn't have for myself. Maybe I would be able to create a holy crusade and be a part of some big, wonderful movement that would sweep me out of my tiny insignificance into some greater purpose. I did not know if all my assumptions were true. It doesn't matter. What I thought was my imagined version of what it would be like to be inside this person. And as I thought about it, I realized that, all of us from time to time are deluded, are tending towards valuing external authority rather than our own internal authority, that we are all prone to some degree of finding and seeking somebody or something out there that will tell us what to do rather than take on the responsibility of coming to our own conclusions about what is true and right and good for us individually. So my empathy for this man grew. My empathy was not automatic. It bloomed slowly after a long process of asking myself the kinds of questions I just mentioned. I need to stress something. This act of empathy I practiced had no impact on a practical level, how I could interact with him. It did not give me tools for how to behave with him that might somehow create more harmony. It was all about my internal transformation. So empathy is defined in various ways. So let me be clear about what I mean by empathy. Empathy is this act of suspending our self-absorption long enough to imagine, if only for a moment, what is life like for another person? What would it be like to live from within the framework of their lived experience right now? We will always do this partially and imperfectly, even with the best efforts. But the effort, however imperfect, produces significant benefits. And as stated before, this internal process of empathy may not and need not flow into an external action. Empathy is different from acts of compassion, although it may inspire and guide acts of compassion under the right condition. And empathy, as I am defining it, does not involve suspending our need to protect ourselves. Empathy, in that case I mentioned, was not going to this man and saying, "Oh, dear man, I know you're oppressed. Let me try to understand you or talk to you." It doesn't involve that. I needed to protect myself from people like him, but I could feel empathy, and that would transform me, not him, and that's okay. Another thing I wish to stress is that empathy directed toward ourselves is as important as empathy we might direct towards others. For there is no one on earth who knows your struggles and your difficulties and your challenges as well as you do. So empathy should be turned towards ourselves as well. The capacity to be empathetic arose very late in our evolutionary history, and due to this fact, it has a precarious position amid other drives, emotions, and instincts. The part of our brain that enables us to be empathetic, the prefrontal cortex, is the only part of the human brain which can reflect on internal events and have insights into the feelings and situations of someone else. It took millions and millions of years for this to evolve, but it was a most momentous event because it enabled the development and the way for higher mammals to relate to others based on empathy. But this leads to a critical point. A critical point. And with us human beings, empathy is like a candle in the wind. Empathy is the last thing, as was the case in my case I described, it was the last thing I thought about after a sequence of other events. And that sequence is almost an internal way of tracing our evolutionary history. My first reaction to the yelling man was a desire to subdue him, was anger, hatred even. I did not think about this. It just came upon me, and it ruled me, and it dominated me. I did not consider the issue of empathy until days later, and that was largely because I was going to talk about it. And I knew that I was going to talk about it. I was experiencing the powerful reactions rooted in our evolutionary past. Some of these patterns, usually dubbed fight, flight, or freeze, enabled our species to survive the immense journey of evolution. They are a defensive measure for our survival. They just happen. But empathy is something that leads us into a completely new way of living. I could have never thought about empathy ever. And this is what happens to a lot of people, that they never get to the point where they think about empathy as a possibility, or they think about it and they confuse it with something in which they'll let their guard for self-protection down. We can lose the practice of empathy very easily in our marriages, in our relationships, in our connections with one another in a congregation. In a congregation, you would be shocked to know that some congregations have conflict. I don't know if I don't, but I can always tell the point at which the system has gone off the edge. And that is when a congregation is in conflict. And I will say something to people about people from the other side that should evoke empathy, and there's no empathetic response. Do you see what I'm saying? And when that happens, I know, oh boy, we're about to go off a cliff here. The same is true for marriages or any important relationship. A spiritual teacher from Atlanta who I admired very much said, "The root of cruelty is the absence of empathy for ourselves and others. When there is no empathy, there is no compassion. When all this is missing, our interactions with others have the potential to be violent." Empathy is a power we can call upon thanks to the gifts of evolution, but it is a capacity easily lost or pushed aside. I can say this with certainty. people experience empathy from others as a powerful connecting force. Empathy must always also be directed to ourselves. Dietrich Bonhoeffer was a Lutheran pastor and a great theologian and teacher in Germany right before World War II. He was involved in a plot to try to kill Hitler and other things. And for a time before he was killed for being a part of that plot, he wrote some interesting articles. And in one of them, he wrote something that I think points to the power and importance of empathy. He wrote, "We must learn to regard people less in the light of what they do or omit to do, and more in the light of what they suffer." Now I invite you to stand in body or in spirit for our closing hymn, number 1021 in the teal hymnal, in the small hymnal, 1021.